Welcome, everybody, to this morning edition. We're thrilled to be able to bring you Judd Legum. Judd is an extraordinary journalist, one of the leaders of this new era of independent journalism, of people that can't be bought off, can't be made to bend the knee, can't be made to capitulate, and fundamentally are on your side if you're an ordinary person out there trying to understand what's going on. I have a political perspective that one of the issues of our time that must be dealt with very squarely is the accumulation of power, government power, police power, tech company power, pharmaceutical company power, the power of monopolists, the power of conglomerates that have stifled competition, that have become intrusive of privacy, have become arrogant, have become officious. It's an extraordinary moment that marks the end of an era, the beginning of a new one at Trump's inaugural, where he is sitting there seating the American oligarchs for the world to see, even in front of his cabinet. The indiscriminate, thoughtless damage done to public institutions without debate by the world's richest man, Elon Musk, the disintegration of that relationship. Judd Legum covers all of it and goes in depth, substantively, reports facts that are necessary for citizens to have in a free society. Where there's no accountability, there can't be any oversight of government. And in this country, government is of the people, by the people, for the people, by design. And so we see a lot of testing, a lot of probing, a lot of assertion, and a lot of crumbling of institutions. And with Judd Legum, you have somebody who can help explain it. If you do not subscribe to Popular Information, I really urge you to do so. This is something that I read very, very, very early in my reading cycle of the day. It's something that I put in the first rank of credibility. I know when Judd Legum says that this is the story of what has happened here, if this is asserted in a Judd Legum story as a fact, it's a fact. And so we have spaces in this country where you can be informed, where you can find out what's happening, but it's on you to go find it. And so to be better informed, I really urge you to go to Popular Information and arm yourself with information. And Popular Information, I imagine, Judd, had a very specific meaning when you named it. Can you take us inside that, how it came to be, and as you were sitting there in that moment that, hey, I'm gonna do this, how'd this get started and how'd the name come to be?
Well, there's a famous quote that a democracy, without popular information or the means for acquiring it, is a prologue to a farce or a tragedy. And that was by James Madison. And the idea being that democracy itself, the whole premise of it, is focused on people having an accurate understanding of the world so they can make decisions. The whole mass of people. And I think that that's something that's really under attack. Obviously, you have an administration now that is basing a lot of its efforts on inculcating people with ideas that are grounded in reality. So that's really what I'm trying to do. And I'm not going to get to everything. I do four newsletters a week, but trying to pick out the things that are the most important, or that not necessarily even the most important, but the things that I feel like are not getting adequate coverage elsewhere, where I can provide some added value, and bringing that to as many people as possible. So it's not designed. I think when I was conceiving of the name, there's a lot of political newsletters that are really geared towards sort of an insidery audience, people who are working in politics, the lobbyists, the staffers, all of those folks. And obviously, there's nothing that they're free to read this newsletter as well. But my goal really is to have to have this appeal to a broad audience, because that's where I think is really the important work to be done, and really an underserved group of people.
So you have this incredible body of work, and it's so in depth. Can you just take us inside how you approach the week? How do you settle on, this is what I'm going to cover this week? How much time goes into each story? How many stories are you developing at any one time? And what's the total footprint of popular information? I mean, your output to me is something that, wow, he must have a giant newsroom behind him. And I suspect in actuality, you don't. But I just, you're very prolific, and you talk about necessary stories across this broad front, and I find them just universally interesting. But like, take us inside that story selection process, that, hey, I'm gonna, like, this is something I got to get on, and I'm gonna go deep on this. And then not the names, of course, of sources, but how do you get into some of this stuff as deeply as you do, while publishing as frequently as you do?
Well, thanks for that question, Steve. I think the way that it really works is that I'm working usually on at least 2 tracks, most of the time 3 or 4. So I'll usually always have a few stories, and these are stories that I can be working on for weeks, for months. I'm working on a story. I'll just kind of give a little teaser for it, because I think I'm finally going to be ready to put it out next week, on a member of Congress who just resigned. And I had some video of him appearing side by side with a lobbyist, and sort of trying to understand what it was he was doing and what the implications of all that were, and contacting people. And I've been working on that for a few weeks now, making sure that I understood this, got the story right. At the same time, I publish 4 times a week at 6:30 in the morning, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And so I always hit those times. And so as I'm working on those stories, I'm slotting them into some of these longer term, stories. And some of them are these ones where I get a tip or a piece of information through people that I know. And I also put my Signal number out there, or my Signal username now out there, so that people can contact me. That was what was going on, of course, a lot in the beginning of this administration. So many people in the federal government just desperate to tell people what's going on.
Has that chilled? Has that changed?
It has. And I think the reason why is I had a lot of people in different agencies, and I produced a lot of reporting on the Social Security, a lot on OMP, different places where I had people who were on the inside, and anytime something that they thought was significant happened, they were reaching out to me. Most of those people have now left. The people that I was talking to, at least, most of them have now left. And I think the ones that are still there, there's been a real crackdown, and people are much more hesitant to talk. And I think my guess is that there's a lot more surveillance going on. There's a lot more aggressive rooting out of anyone who was trying to get information out there. It still occurs, but it's nowhere near the level that it was. I think also part of it is sort of this natural kind of, I think the things that were happening initially were such a shock. Maybe people aren't even reaching out as much because what's going on doesn't even shock them as much anymore. But yeah, I have that, and then so some of these stories are days or weeks, and some of them are from tips, some of them are research projects that I'm looking at data, or there's filings coming out. I'm understanding like when the end of this month we've got a big filing, so we'll understand, and they'll finally be disclosed who's contributed to all of the super PACs, the main Senate super PACs, the House super PACs. That'll be pretty interesting to see what happens. But then other times I don't have one of those landings, so I'm going to go and find something that I can turn around in 6 or 7 hours. I do have 2 full-time staff people who help me out, so we can get, between the 3 of us, we can get pretty in depth in 6 or 7 hours and try to find something new, talk to some folks, look at some primary source information, and we'll get something out the next day. So those are sort of the 2 ways in which it occurs, and they're all kind of all going on at once. And it can be a bit of a challenge, but it's something I really enjoy doing. So I don't consider it a burden. It's just, that's kind of, my way of life. And then you get something out and you're thinking about the next idea.
How do you know when something's hit? What do you measure success as, right? At some level, you've made the commitment to report it. You've done it with integrity. You've put it out there. So there's pride in the work. But how do you know when this is a piece of information that's really landed with the public? And how often are you seeing your original reporting then picked up in other places and carried forward? And is there crossover of popular information reporting into that corporate media space where they're sourcing popular information, right, as the credible, independent, investigative news agency who has brought to light something that was not in the public sphere prior?
Yeah, that certainly does happen. And we try to put all the information into each newsletter so that people can feel confident of that. So if we are going to report on a memo that was produced by the Social Security Agency, a big one that we put out was one where they were describing the impacts of scaling back and really eliminating phone service for a huge swath of beneficiaries. And it was really described as potentially catastrophic. This was in an internal memo. That was widely picked up by a lot of media outlets. I think that ultimately what I'm looking for is impact. I don't think this is just a process where you're just entertaining people or trying to, just find something that people enjoy reading. I hope people do enjoy reading it. I hope people feel like they're getting something out of it. But at the end of the day, I want the work to have an impact on the world. So a story that we worked on earlier this year regarding the big fight about the Supreme Court race in North Carolina, which was the very last race of 2024 to be decided. The Republican candidate was trying to throw out tens of thousands of ballots and actually convinced the same Supreme Court of North Carolina that he was running for to throw out a bunch of ballots on the grounds that they had never lived in North Carolina. We actually found, and even with a local partner that we teamed up with, talked to many of these folks and found that they had in fact lived in North Carolina. Some of them had never lived anywhere else. And it was just, as often these things are, a data error that was then cited in both state and federal court, and ultimately in the decisions that settled that election. So that's not going to happen all the time. But for me, that says, okay, we dug into it. We worked hard on this story. We got out and substantiated the facts. And now it's had an impact. Other things are going to have an impact over time. I think it's not going to be, you put the story out, it appears in this lawsuit, and then the lawsuit goes one way. It's going to be something that occurs over months and years. and hopefully you help shape people's understanding of an important issue.
How do you approach this ICE issue? I'll give you a political analysis of this, which is that this perversely named propaganda-like named bill, the big, beautiful bill, so big, so incomprehensible, and there's so many things in it that will harm people, do real damage. We could talk about it for many, many hours. There's one big thing that didn't get through the bill, which as a political learning is important, and that was the public land sell-off that Mike Lee tried to orchestrate, which was an act of profound, Taylor Sheridan could write 30 series about the corruption in that public land spinoff. But what the bill will be historically is that this created a national secret police force that, if it was a military, would be the 15th ranked military force in the world, which is a very potent military. And they got it through without a lot of debate. And now all of a sudden, and it struck me that there was an ICE official, a sector chief, leaning against a armored vehicle, and he said he doesn't work for Karen Bass, and the federal government will do whatever it wants in Los Angeles. And I wish someone had asked him a follow-up question, because I wonder who it is that he believes that he works for, right? If it would have been Tom Homan or Kristi Noem or Donald Trump, I suspect his answer would not have been, well, I work for the people. And of course he does. He works for us. So you look at this guy, the sector chief, and he's got his long rifle. He's got a AR. It's got a ammunition kit, on the back of it, the whole deal, militarized picture. And it makes you think, well, who's the enemy here? And so I'm 54, and I've worked in a White House. I've worked in the Congress. I've worked for the governor of California. I've worked in politics all around the world at every level. And there's never been an official with the title sector chief that's mattered in the life of an American citizen. I wonder all of a sudden how many powerful sector chiefs who command armies we're going to have in the United States posing on armored vehicles, announcing that the official who got millions of votes in the second largest city in the country and the fourth largest in North America doesn't matter, and their officiousness and their arrogance. So I think that story, right, and the change to society it will bring, and the chaos it's going to unleash. How do you intend to cover this? Right? Do you think is ICE penetratable? Right, the National Guard soldiers that are cooped up in this cosplaying performance. Like, how do you conceptualize the coverage of a story that, at some level, if we were sitting around talking about this 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, this would be a crazy conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, looking at the bill, the bill that passed, it did not pass because the components of it were popular, or that the whole thing put together was popular. It passed because they had the power to pass it, and that's what they did. And so I think that what happens next is going to depend on people's understanding of how this plays out, how it impacts society. I agree that this ICE issue and really the unfathomable amount of money that was given to ICE, not just, oh, well, let's double their assets. So this is 12, 13 times, what they had to work with before in a lot of these categories. So how do we allow people to begin to understand how these resources are being used? I don't think people want a secret police that's roaming the country, snatching up their neighbors. The reason why Trump was successful kind of demagoguing on this is because he painted the idea that he was going to be rounding up these horrible criminals. I think they've already run out of folks to target. They're ripping people out of these communities who've been there for decades, no criminal history. So for me, I'm thinking about, well, how can I get into the story? I was actually looking at this today. One of the things I want to do, and I think it's going to be not too long, but probably a couple of months before this happens. Every contract that ICE is going to sign to spend this money, because they're not actually going to be able to spend it internally themselves. They're going to have to just outsource a lot of this because they don't have the capacity to spend this much money, is public information that's listed on the government contracting database. And so that's, I think, a pressure point, because there's going to be a lot of people, I think, quite quick. I mean, there's a lot of people already who are very upset. Joe Rogan is very upset because he didn't think there was any possibility to predict this. But many people are very upset. And I think that allowing people to understand, well, what corporations are going to be complicit in this, who are going to be grabbing for this, a piece of these billions of dollars, that's something where I think I'm going to add value, because I don't think a lot of other folks are going to be looking at that closely.
Is the private prison industry an area that is of interest specifically to you, or that you think about as top of mind as you follow the money on this?
Yeah. In fact, we just did a story last week. This was while all this other stuff was happening, the bill was passing, all of that. There was a very quiet story that the FCC had reversed a rule. It was put in place last year that would prevent companies from charging incarcerated people these outrageous fees for phone calls. Something like $12 for a 15-minute phone call in a lot of these facilities. And there's really no reason. And so the question is, well, why are they doing this? Because the companies that sell these telecommunication services of prisons is not really AT&T. It's relatively small companies. They don't really even get a lot of money to candidates. So why are they doing this? Looking into it, the reason why these fees are so high is because the people who operate the prisons, including Geo Group, Core Civic, the big private companies, they get a kickback, sometimes as much as 50% of all of the revenue that these companies bring in, and they get it sent back to them as part of the contracts that they sign. So we now have that industry, which, as you know, is one of the top industries as far as, donating money to the Trump super PACs, donating money to the inauguration, just really one of the industries that really went all in on Trump. And now you have the FCC for really no reason. Actually, the chairman of the FCC, Brendan Carr, who's very conservative, voted for this rule last year, because no one's really for this. Even if I don't think anyone is pro-criminal, but nobody thinks they should have to pay $15 to talk to their daughter or their mother for a few minutes when they have the opportunity to. voted for it. Now it's been a sudden reversal. And I think it's that influence of the private prison industry. And so, yes, I think they're highly influential. I think there's very little accountability for how they operate. And it's something that I'm going to have a very close eye on. I think they're probably going to be one of the primary beneficiaries of all of this money.
When you think about, I had an experience that is among the most astonishing of my life in this conversation, but it was at Auschwitz. And, the first time I went to Auschwitz, it was part of the U.S. delegation for the 60th anniversary of the liberation. And Elie Wiesel was on that trip. And I spent fair amount of time with him, which was an extraordinary experience. And then I went back last March, and I went on a tour with the head guide. His name is Paul Powell, and he was a journalist who left a radio news job to become teacher, educator, guide there, and he took Elon Musk around. And I asked him, I said, well, did it make an impression at all? And he said, I'm afraid not. And that was early in the day out on this tour. And so, I had a couple of takeaways from the experience, but, one of them is that as you comprehend the place, it was that even the people like Elie Wiesel, who survived Auschwitz, really didn't fully experience Auschwitz, in that the only people who did were the ones who walked down the steps into the showers, into the gas, and into the ovens, right? And there was no surviving that, right? Nobody came back from that. Nobody survived that. And so we're in this corner of the camp, and he tells me this story about what he describes as the Polish Clint Eastwood, who escapes from Auschwitz. They kill a couple of SS guards, and we're sitting off in this corner, and he says, people will say to me things like, well, is it true that even the birds don't fly over Auschwitz? And he points out a stork that is taking off from one of the ponds where the SS dumped the ashes of the murdered Jews. And he says, look, there's a stork taking off. And he points to a building, and he says, do you know what type of building that is? And I said, that's a water treatment facility. And he says, that's correct. And he goes, did you know that Auschwitz opened up late? And I said, I didn't know that. And he said they couldn't get the permits for the water treatment, for the waste sewage plant, and for the fire codes in the barracks. And he goes, the SS was not omnipotent in Germany. It was an agency of the government. It was powerful. It was corrupt, but the Germans were a highly organized bureaucratic society and needed the stamp. And when the SS announced that the plan was to dump the waste of the 100,000 prisoners in the prison designed in the woods to hold 100,000 people, right? The German bureaucrat didn't say, why are we building a prison for 100,000 people in the woods here in Poland? He said, where are you dumping the waste for the 100,000 people? When they said in the river, and there were Germans downriver, he said 9. And so the killing gets off to a late start in Auschwitz, and these buildings are built to last. And we're sitting there, and he pulls out of his pocket a piece of the paper, and he goes, this is the permit. And he goes, that's the stamp that opened Auschwitz. And so it didn't open with a bullet to the head. It opened with a stamp from a water bureaucrat. And as this concentration camp, and it is a concentration camp, and I'll debate anyone till the end times, right, about that and the definition of what a concentration camp is in Florida. is that in the debate we had as a society in the aftermath of World War II, where people look back and say, what did we know about the Holocaust and the camps and what could have been done? Could it have been bombed? The rail lines. And of course, the leaders of the Allied countries, fundamentally said, well, in order to bring the killing to an end, the abuses to an end, we win the war. So anything that diverts us from winning the war prolongs the suffering of the Jews in the camp. And once you're in that position, there's an elemental pragmatism that gets involved. But at the beginning, right now, as the camp is coming to be, as it's coming to be formed, and they have a budget of $45 billion to construct these camps. And to put that in perspective, the top line NFL stadiums, the one in Vegas and the one in LA, the SoFi Stadium, where when you walk into it, you say, holy shit, those two stadiums cost $2 billion each. So I don't know what $45 billion worth of these detention camps, concentration camps look like across the United States. And I just like, how do you think about that as an issue and covering that as a society issue? Because at some level, to me, even talking about this in those terms, like as I feel totally confident at an honesty level, an integrity level, right, at a truthfulness level about we have to talk about this, but at the same time, I'm like, am I crazy? And the truth is, I'm not crazy. So, like, how do we talk about the coverage of this burgeoning $45 billion of concentration camp building out across the country?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you're crazy bringing that up. And I think one of the things that people forget is that really the fundamental legal principle that we're now, the Trump administration is now fighting against by setting up, these concentration camps, these detention facilities. We've seen one get created in Florida that I think is probably the, maybe it's the blueprint for the others. Is that there was a concern that the United States did not do enough to take in Jews that were threatened in Germany and elsewhere and provide them with asylum, provide them with refuge. And that's why we passed a law in the United States where we do not simply turn away anyone who shows up in the country without, all of their paperwork. We have a process in which they are able to make a case that they would be subject to persecution if they were to return home. And if they can prove that, they can stay here. That's something we decided after we saw what happened in World War II and decided that we were not going to do so little again as far as taking people in. So now we have completely abandoned that, and we're going really back into the opposite way. So I think understanding the legal history and really the fundamental principles that are behind our immigration laws is important. That's not to say that 2025 is the same as 1965 or 1945, and that we shouldn't make adjustments. But there was a time when Democrats and Republicans understood that these were human beings that deserved compassion and that shouldn't be demonized. So hopefully we can find a way back to this. I think what we're dealing with right now is an experiment to see how far this can be pushed. And it's quite distressing. It's quite distressing. But what keeps me going and wanting to understand as much as I can about it and then share that with the people, who read my newsletter and get the information I put out elsewhere is that I've also seen how these things can shift rapidly back and forth. And sometimes it takes, unfortunately, a severe overreach in order to provoke that kind of shift backwards too. So I think that's what's confronting us here is are we going to go deeper and deeper and deeper into the darkness here as we, round up folks, or is there going to be a reality check?
There's a reason that the manager of the Yankees gets more media coverage than the AAA team in Columbus that gets more coverage than the AA manager, the single A manager. So when you think about people in the government and in the hierarchy, we cover the people at the top of the chain, the people that have Senate confirmed jobs, the secretaries of defense and state and so on and so forth. But the commandant, right, the warden of this camp in Florida, is that an individual who's worthy of tough and unrelenting media scrutiny, along with, say, for example, the sector chief in Los Angeles, who's leaned against the armored vehicle saying, we're not leaving as the city is held under a siege by its federal government.
I think so.
Is that somebody that should be covered relentlessly?
I think so. And I think that, there's a real effort to try to intimidate people against that kind of coverage, say that, this is the media trying to dox, this person, or, trying to subject them to harm. I'm not going to print, their home address or something like that. I'm not going to talk about, I'm not going to, hand out their phone number so people can call them. But I think letting people understand who they are, what their background is, how are they acting. These are people, all of these positions are positions where someone's supposed to be acting in the public trust. They're supposed to be acting in accordance with their local laws, the state laws, federal laws, the Constitution. So all of that is fair game, because ultimately, it's not going to be Donald Trump that is rounding all the people up. He's not going to be the one doing it. So if you limit your coverage just to the very top, you're going to miss a lot of the story. I think that it also just is such a limiting lens to look at it, because if you only write, and this is, I try to think about this, as I'm thinking about how do you plan out your week. If every story I'm writing is just Donald Trump said this and that's not true, I could just write that story every day, but I don't think people would. And sometimes you need to write that story because it's an important story to write that particular day. But I don't think that's going to get people anywhere that they aren't already. People need to understand the full spectrum of how all of this works, and that's what I think creates a greater level of understanding and a greater level of accountability. Because right now it's probably past date to hold Trump accountable for anything, but there's a lot of other people he's going to need to work by his side who still can be held accountable, and I think that's a really important piece of business.
One of the things that I find most curious about all of this, and I've had this conversation privately, but also on the warning, is the degree to which you look at the arrogance of the people involved in this, and there's no semblance of restraint or notion of, well, we may be voted out and hauled before congressional committees 2 years from now. It's as if they are deluded into believing that Trump's Teflon, right, covers all of them. And I know it is their arrogance in the moment, right? And that's the craziness. And it's not the fact that, right, they know something that I don't know, right? And right? They've got in the plan that it's all over and that it's entirely the arrogance. But do you ever sit there and scratch your head when you look at the performances of some of the spokespeople, the disrespect, the factlessness, the lying, the yelling, the preening, the performance of a Carolyn Levitt? I mean, um, I know my audience is skewing my age and up, right? I know, but I hope we have some young people on here, and they're just not old enough to remember Baghdad Bob, right? Who was Saddam Hussein's spokesperson, right? And was a caricature, right, of dishonesty, right? Literally at the airport saying the Americans will never take the airport as the tanks are rolling behind them. I mean, Carolyn Levitt is that level of disingenuousness and totally crazy. And, in fairness to Baghdad Bob, right, Saddam Hussein was going to shoot him probably, right, if he didn't say like what he needed to say, right? And, Trump's not going to shoot Carolyn Levitt, I don't think. But like, do you ever scratch your head and think about these people? Like, it seems like they haven't imagined that they're about to be voted out of here, right? At least in the Congress in 2 years, like that there's no possibility of it. Or is that just me?
Yeah, I mean, I think it definitely takes a certain kind of person to be willing to do that. That's for sure. I think somebody like Carolyn Levitt, like, when I think about it, I think she'll probably get a soft landing somewhere. I could see her getting set up, on a nice show on Newsmax or something like that, and it'll probably be fine. She may not ever have to confront, what she's been involved with. The thing that I just can't quite understand are these institutions and people who are definitely going to be around at a time where you'd have to think there's at least a fair possibility that it's going to be a much different political environment. You look at the Washington Post, which has really taken decades of work, establishing itself as one of the premier journalistic outlets, and kind of flushed a lot of it down the drain in a few months here in an effort to appease Trump. I saw that, just before we were getting on here, I saw that they sent out a letter to all their staff talking about how, this is a new era. They've revamped their opinion page, the opinion page that, endorsed Pam Bondi for Attorney General, and, is doing everything they can to kind of cozy up to Trump. And if you're not, if you're not on board with all of this, we're happy to accept your resignation, and we'll give you some, severance package. They are going to be around when they're going to have credibility with a variety of audiences. Trump is not going to be able to help them.
Do you think that they have credibility as an institution?
Not anymore. Not anymore. I mean, I think that there's certainly journalists there that I respect who continue to do great work, kind of in spite of it, so that nothing to do with the institution anymore. But I think the readers, they've lost hundreds of thousands of readers. They're searching for a reader that doesn't really exist. But it's clear that the priority is to create good feelings within one person, which is Donald Trump. And that has worked. Donald Trump has praised Jeff Bezos and what Jeff Bezos has done at the Post publicly. Jeff Bezos said that's what he was going to do. That's what he set out to do once Trump got elected, and it's working. But the thing that I don't understand is that's going to work for a few years, and then we're going to, at some point, move on to something else, or we might. And where is that going to leave him? And that's really what I don't understand. These are supposed to be some of the most sophisticated people in the world. These kind of capitalist savants or whatever you want to call them. It seems like if I can think of it, they probably can also think of this, but for some reason they do not care, or they're not thinking about it.
Well, right, from the Bezos perspective, right? You have to, let's unpack this. So Jeff Bezos says, well, this is what the consumer demands. This is what the audience needs to have in the way of news. And all of the changes to the editorial pages, right, reflect this sensibility. And this is a guy who just threw the wedding that he threw, right? So Jeff Bezos throws that wedding and he thinks that the people of the world care about this as opposed to being appalled by it, right? So he lives in a total bubble of surreality and delusion, but he's certainly not alone. I mean, I don't necessarily think he's any more delusional than David Zasloff, for example, right? At some level, right, David Zasloff is even more offensive given that, right, it's a failing public company and he's managed to, right, figure out how to rig a theft of $52 million of compensation, right, from the shareholders. But it's just also corrupt. And and I wanted to ask you about that, which is what motivates you to kind of chase down the corruption in an era that is just so unfathomably corrupt and so fast? I mean, when I was in the White House, I had a SCI security clearance, and then I had a political job. And I dealt with the press. And so I was terrified at all times of breaking the Hatch Act, violating the Hatch Act, which was a real thing if you worked in the Bush or the Obama administrations until Kellyanne disregarded it, and terrified of making a mistake with a piece of classified information. And the truth is, right, you see these classified briefings and, right, what was in the briefing was on the front page of the New York Times. Some reporter asks you a question about a story on the front page of the New York Times after you saw the classified briefing in the morning, right? You're in a difficult position. So I never talked about any of that, right? Just never wanted to talk about any of that stuff. But the corruption, the lying, the dishonesty, like what keeps you motivated to keep chasing it as opposed to feeling defeated and drowned by it? Because the waters are rising everywhere with it, right? It's so much worse than it was last year, which was worse than it was the year before, which was worse than it was the year before, in this titanic tidal wave of epic corruption.
Yeah, it is stunning. I mean, I think just not that Trump is using the presidency to, profit for himself. I mean, that I think everyone expected, but just the brazenness that's going on. I think I stay motivated because I'm trying to look at the long-term view of this. One of the things that is demotivating is you are not going to shame this group of people into changing what they're doing. They're going to keep doing it. So you kind of have to put that because that's usually one of the nice things about exposing something that's corrupt is that, if you expose it, well, then they might stop. That's not going to happen. But do
you find that to be a threat in the coverage, though, of him, that it holds out a possibility that it could stop, it may stop, he may do the right thing today? Because I think that's endemic to like 90% of the media coverage. And I don't mean to interrupt you.
I do think that there's a normality about the coverage that doesn't reflect the abnormality of the behavior.
Right.
So I think to that extent, yes, I agree with that.
And your point is like they're the Goodfellas crew, and the Goodfellas crew is going to steal shit, right?
Yes.
And so Donald Trump isn't going to stop doing what he's doing. And so go ahead. I didn't mean to
Yeah,
cut
but
you
I
off
was going
on
to
that.
say that I think what they are, the goal of this is just to push ahead and to exhaust people into kind of throwing up their hands. And to a certain extent, it's working, but I want to try to be a counterbalance of that. So we spent a long time and written several articles about, about Jared Kushner and this investment fund that he set up, which is mostly money from Saudi Arabia and other countries, and how he's now funneled that. Now, Jared Kushner has never been in private equity. He has never done anything about this. In fact, his primary experience was nearly bankrupting his family business, which he inherited, and he got bailed out of that. So no one would ever give him money. And in fact, the independent board in Saudi Arabia that decides to do this said this is a ridiculous thing. We're against it, and only the Crown Prince, overruled them. But then you have him now funneling the money. He's now acting as a funnel, and they're building, new Trump towers in the Middle East and in Europe. And so the money's going directly from Saudi Arabia into Jared Kushner's, affinity partners. He takes his management fee and all of the other cuts, and he's then giving it to essentially his father-in-law, Donald Trump, and the rest of the Trump sons. It's gotten very little coverage. I think is probably the most brazenly corrupt scheme in presidential history. Just taking money from a foreign government and just pouring it right. It just giving these millions of dollars right to the president. I'm not going to get defeated by that. We're just going to keep beating the drum and try to make sure that there's at least someone watching this occur.
So let me just set to this story on the facts, and correct me if my memory faults here and I get a detail of this wrong. But some 6 months after leaving the Trump White House, where Jared Kushner was initially denied a security clearance, was granted one by presidential intervention, and according to multiple news reports, was the primary consumer of the nation's most closely guarded secrets, was insatiable with his desire to have access to compartmentalized information. Jared Kushner, 6 months after leaving, takes in $2 billion of direct investment to an investment fund, despite having no experience investing anything anywhere at any time ever, takes the money against the recommendation of the Saudi professional advisors who advised the sovereign wealth fund. The Crown Prince directly intervenes, gives Jared the money. And I said at the time, this isn't a conflict of interest story. This is an espionage story. That is like, we have a country why is Aldrich Ames in prison? Right? Why is I was thinking of the FBI agent, Robert, these guys, these were small timers, right? In terms of the money that was taken, it's astonishing amounts of money. And I couldn't agree with you more on the fact that it's probably the most brazen act of corruption in the entire history of the country. That's right, Robert Hansen. Thank you. Postcards from home. It's like the third time today I've had a memory failure on someone's name. So I don't know what's going on, but Robert Hansen. But it's astonishing, right? To behold the corruption. Why do you think that there isn't more coverage of it on the television shows? Is it a resource issue? Is it that that our audience doesn't care? Too complex a story, right? There's easier stories to tell, right? Why isn't there more coverage of this?
I don't think it's too complex. And I don't think that people think there's a lack of interest. I do think it's an issue where members of the media have decided that because Trump's core voter base does not care, that this is not worthy of continual coverage. There was a much more complicated story, which I think was a legitimate story, which was when Hillary Clinton was running for office in 2016. There was concern that foreign governments who donated to the Clinton Foundation, not her, but the Clinton Foundation, would then get some kind of special access as a result because they've donated to the Clinton Foundation. The Clinton Foundation's then using that money to, buy anti-malarial drugs or whatever they're doing. I think that's a legitimate thing to talk about. That could be a conflict. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I did an analysis between January 1st, 2015 and Election Day. So that basically the whole campaign in 2016, the New York Times wrote 79 stories about this issue. That's one story a week for 22 months about the possibility that now they were going to stop taking foreign money if she were to have won. So this is about prior money being given out, not while she was president. Now we have money that's being doled out while he's president that is not going to a charity, but is directly benefiting a company that is owned and controlled by Donald Trump. And it has gotten a couple of stories, but you don't see this kind of continual coverage that can drive it into the consciousness of the American voter. I bet very few people are even aware that this has occurred because it got...
Why won't they cover it? Why do you think?
I do think it's an idea that his voters don't care. That somehow it's when it's your voters that are... I actually don't know. I mean, I'm speculating. I don't know. I think it deserves more coverage. And of course, there's ways to continue this because he's now using this money. He's developing, an island in Albania. And every time he's doing this, it's creating conflicts because now Trump and Kushner's profits are contingent on good relationships with those local governments because they need to get all the permits and everything else that they're doing. This is occurring simultaneously while Trump is renegotiating tariff rates with every country on earth. So will the countries that Trump needs to maintain good relationships are to complete these projects get better tariff rates? That's certainly something I'm keeping my eye on with this. And I think that to the extent, I don't think it's true that people do not care about these issues. Now, do Trump's core voters, the 25 or 30% of Americans who are going to go out and vote for Trump no matter what happens, did they care? Probably not, because they don't seem to change their view on this. But I do think there are people who care, and there are people who would want to see other folks take a stand on this if it could be raised. Now, hopefully, I mean, one thing that could happen, that could change, things change, if the Democrats, regain, let's say, the House, one of the chambers, something like that, they could have hearings. They could have a hearing on this. They could subpoena people. They could get more information out there. And that's something that I see as, okay, well, we have to start setting the predicate for this and start laying out the facts so that at least when we get to the point at which that might be a possibility, maybe those members of Congress can understand what's at stake and what's going.
Well, I send your stuff around to no small number of members of Congress, and we talk about it, right? On text, and it makes an impact, and they see it, even though, right, the opposition, such as it is in the Congress, isn't hitting like I would like to see it hit. And there's a bunch of different reasons for that. But let me just say, as we come up on the hour, my admiration for you is immense. You are a person of integrity. You truly are the best of what journalism is. And what journalism is a public service that is essential in a free society to give the public the information they need to have to hold the government of the people, by the people, for the people accountable, because some of the people are bad. And that's the way it's always been, right? And power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as the saying goes. And so one of the things when you consider the collapse, and I consider it a collapse of corporate media, the integrity of so many institutions that we counted on. If you took a glass and you threw it against the wall and it fractured and all those shards fell into the soil. Right, that's how you have to think about that moment. But because this is the United States, that soil is hospitable because of the First Amendment to an independent journalism. And at the foremost front of that, the tip of the spear, the best of the best, and really getting into complex issues, covering them with a great deal of integrity and putting it out there, not looking for outrage, not looking to antagonize and to incite, but to inform, to arm. An informed citizen is a dangerous citizen to the authority of any oppressive, tyrannical force. And that is essential in this moment. And so for the 2,500 people on this evening, Wednesday evening, who've taken time out of your night, thank you for joining. Really urge all of you who follow me, please subscribe to Judd Legum and support that work. You can't do it simply by force of his personality and indefatigability. He needs your support, and I hope you'll consider giving it to him. Judd, I'm going to leave the final word with you tonight to say goodnight to everybody. But thank you so much for joining and for the conversation, and keep up the great job you're doing. You really are a great patriot, and the work that journalists do like yourself is the work of patriots at a time when this country is in a great crisis because of all the lying, because of all the power grabbing, because of all the corruption, and because of all of the people who have lost faith in a really powerful idea. So thank you so much for being here with all of us tonight.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Stephen. I think I've really enjoyed this conversation. I think, it's very clear why you've collected such a large and passionate following on this platform. You bring such a rich political and historical perspective to all of these issues, which I think is so important, because we get wrapped up in each moment. Every year it's like the moments and the news cycle. We used to talk about news cycles as if it was a day or an hour, and it's just the unit of time keeps getting shorter and shorter. So I think it's really important to broaden your aperture out to understand the scope of things. And I think you really help people do that. Thanks for having me, for hosting me. And thanks everyone for tuning in and listening.
Thank you, Judd. Keep up the fight.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning. I invite you to join this community where I promise to be honest, blunt, and direct about what is happening in this country. America is in crisis. Follow and subscribe to this channel and on Substack. Thank you.